I want to first just give many, many thanks to all those who have planned and organized this conference and all those involved in administering it now, running around and helping us all, often in ways that are partly hidden and in the background. People are working so hard. It's a Herculean effort. And the conference just seems to be enormously successful so far. So thank you so much. We're all benefiting enormously from your efforts. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss a movement first within the modern study of religion that has been called Buddhist critical-constructive reflection. It's also been called Buddhist theology. And I'm going to discuss its two basic goals and how analogues of those two goals have been operative throughout Buddhist history in Asia and now also in the West. That is, Buddhism newly informing and being informed by each culture in which it becomes integrated. Some current applications of Buddhist constructive reflection in light of that history will be discussed, including ways that modern Buddhist thinkers are drawing on traditional Buddhist resources together with the social and natural sciences to try to address current questions and problems. And as modern Buddhism makes new contributions in these ways, however, it also risks succumbing or accommodating too much the modern assumptions of the modern world, modern assumptions and values. So much so that modern Buddhism, its ability to offer important alternatives to modern assumptions and values can get quite reduced. So an example of this will also be noted in the talk. So although my focus here is on Buddhism, I think many of you will see interesting parallels and differences with analogous theological developments in other religious traditions represented at this conference. So let me just back up a little bit. The modern academic study of religions under the rubric of religious studies or history of religions analyzes how religious concepts and practices develop within historical and cultural contexts. Now, this way of analyzing religions emerged in the modern Western academy under the influence of the European Enlightenment. And central to its emergence has been the method of epoché, avoiding judgments of normative truth and value in order to open a new space in the academy for the historical study of religions, free from Christian judgments on non-Christian religions, and also free from pre-modern Christian assumptions about Christianity's own developments. In 20th century Europe and the Americas, departments of religious studies, history of religions, and cultural studies that included study of religions were established in hundreds of universities, while university theology departments and seminaries remained the loci of Christian theological studies. Therefore, an institutional separation was made between religious studies on the one hand and theological studies on the other. And whereas religious studies scholars used historical and social analysis of religions descriptively as a source of data for academic theorization, Christian theologians like Karl Rahner and Paul Tillich, Johann Baptist Metz, Elizabeth Johnson, Gustavo Gutierrez, and Yvonne Gabarra, for example, used the same kinds of historical and social analysis for normative, not merely descriptive purposes. That is, to see how such analyses could inform newly effective ways to understand, practice, and apply truths of Christianity in the modern world. Okay so far? By the 1980s and 90s, late 20th century, the institutional separation of religious studies from Christian theology had begun to unleash new kinds of interest in the academy. A number of non-Christian PhD students in religious studies programs wanted to apply the critical findings of the academy to clarify the truth and value of their own religious traditions in the current world from a critical constructive perspective, as Christian theologians do, like the ones I just named. This included scholars of the various Asian traditions, prominently Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and Confucianism. But there was no ready-made academic location in the Western Academy for such non-Christian theological work. The Western Religious Studies Academy was dedicated to the descriptive study of religions, not normative religious reflection, while normative reflection was housed mainly in Christian theological institutions. The interest in normative, critical religious reflection arose strongly in the Buddhist studies wing of the Academy at the turn of this century, in part, I would suggest, because of growing global interest in Buddhism, which included a normative concern to explore ways of drawing on Buddhism as a resource to help address modern questions and problems. That's a normative concern. Also in this period, a new generation of scholars who are doing PhDs in Buddhist studies and who also practiced Buddhism wanted to use the academic disciplines to help clarify normative possibilities of their Buddhist traditions. So in 2006, some of these Buddhist scholars, and I was one of those, established a new area of study in the American Academy of Religion dedicated to Buddhist critical constructive reflection, which has also been called Buddhist theology, because it represents a niche in the academy for combining modern critical analysis of a tradition with normative reflection upon it, much as other academic theologians do, including Christian theologians. It's very analogous. Hence, the term Buddhist theology is not actually bizarre. It describes a location within the academy, or carves out a location within the academy to make possible normative reflection that also draws on critical resources. Is that kind of clear? But the term theology is pretty unpopular in Buddhist circles, and therefore, most of us involved in this movement in the academy settled on the term Buddhist critical constructive reflection, which I'm going to call BCR, so I don't trip over that expression. Is that okay? Buddhist critical constructive reflection, BCR, or Buddhist theology. This kind of reflection has had two goals. That is to reflect critically on aspects of Buddhism in light of contemporary understandings, and also to reflect critically on contemporary understandings in light of Buddhism. The first goal involves drawing on modern academic disciplines together with Buddhist understandings to newly inform aspects of Buddhism in normative ways, or at least suggest normative possibilities. The second goal involves drawing on Buddhism to address contemporary problems and needs, and to newly inform current areas of knowledge, such as philosophy, psychology, ecology, cognitive science, and economics. Thus, while academic work in religious studies is primarily etic, an outsider point of view, and descriptive, Buddhist critical constructive reflection, BCR, draws on those etic findings together with emic, insider Buddhist understandings, to suggest new normative directions for Buddhism, society, and academia. Okay, so while the focus here is on BCR, Buddhist constructive reflection, academic theological work by scholars of other non-Christian religious traditions has also been growing in recent decades, as witnessed also here at this conference by other keynote speakers. Now, how did I become involved in this recent development in the academy? To concretize it a little bit, how did I get sucked into this development? The need for new normative Buddhist critical reflection first occurred to me as a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison when I read an essay by Donald Lopez, a Buddhist studies scholar, a very eminent one, who maintains the religious studies posture of restricting himself to descriptive analysis of religions while avoiding normative concerns. So I'll note some of the historical background assumed in Lopez's essay before very briefly discussing that essay, okay? Generally speaking, religious change has not been of value in Asian Buddhist cultures. That is, for traditional Asian Buddhists generally, if Buddhist understandings and practices were seen to have changed significantly over time within new cultural contexts, it would tend to signify that they had fallen away from the original teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha. Now, given that non-historicizing assumption, Asian Buddhists traditionally have used various strategies to establish legitimacy for new Buddhist developments in cultures, that are experienced by Buddhists in those cultures as profound and true and enormously transformative and liberating. They've used various strategies to establish legitimacy for such new developments in cultures while hiding their newness. So one such strategy involved use of the Buddhist doctrine of skillful means, upaya kaushalya, which in one principal meaning refers to the pedagogical methods Shakyamuni Buddha used to meet the differing mentalities of individuals, he taught, in ways that were effective and transformational for each individual. A related hermeneutic function of the skillful means doctrine has been to help sacralize and legitimate Mahayana Buddhist sutras. Those are scriptures attributed to Shakyamuni Buddha that were composed by Buddhist sages centuries after the Buddha lived. Mahayana sutras express diverse Buddhist doctrines, cosmologies, and practices that emerged in a variety of Asian cultural contexts in the early centuries CE. Mahayana Buddhist scholars in India, East Asia, and Tibet sought to make systematic sense of competing messages in these Buddhist scriptures, and also in earlier Buddhist scriptures, not by historicizing them, but by attributing them all to the Buddha's skillful way of teaching the Dharma in different phases of his own teaching career during his lifetime in ancient India. Now back to Donald Lopez and his essay. In his essay, which is called On the Interpretation of Mahayana Sutras, Lopez explains how one such renowned Buddhist scholar, the 7th century Indian teacher Chandrakirti, employed the doctrine of skillful means as an interpretive principle to gain control over all previous Buddhist scriptures and traditions by depicting them as preparatory steps taught by Shakyamuni Buddha himself toward the realization of Chandrakirti's own Mahayana perspective. In other words, Lopez explained, Chandrakirti naively identified his own 7th century CE Mahayana perspective on the Buddhist scriptures with Shakyamuni's 5th century BCE point of view on them. Okay? So we have a pretty intense critique by a Western religious studies scholar with no interest in normative concerns. What are Lopez's conclusions? Taking Chandrakirti as his example, Lopez asserts that the Mahayana Buddhist commentator's basic goal in explaining a Buddhist scripture's meaning is to pretend that he can replicate the Buddha's intention behind the scripture. Such an interpretive approach, wrote Lopez, is in Hans Georg Gadamer's terms romantic and inadequate because the Buddhist commentator is unaware both of the historical nature of the text he comments on and of his own historically conditioned perspective on it. This is all Lopez's analysis. The goal of the Buddhist interpreter, then, Lopez declared, is to use the doctrine of skillful means to reinterpret diverse Buddhist literary traditions in a homogeneous way that supports the interpreter's own perspective on them all as the final perspective within a closed system, while hiding the newness of his project by ascribing his own perspective to the Buddha. In the end, Lopez concludes, Buddhist interpretation is the Buddhist exegete's projection of prejudice upon a received text. The end. That's his final conclusion. As a PhD student at the time who was Buddhist, I found Lopez's conclusions both insightful and also disappointing. The problem for me was not his critical analysis, but the ultimate purpose for doing it. That's the key issue for me. In his article, Lopez worked ethically as an outsider to Buddhist tradition, critiquing the hegemonic approach of Asian Buddhist commentators. Lopez, as a religious studies scholar who withholds judgment on normative questions, did not think to explore the normative implications of his findings for current Buddhist understanding. As an academic scholar, I appreciated his critical findings, but as someone who also practices within Buddhist communities, East and West, I saw his conclusions as merely preliminary to important questions that he never thought to raise. For example, how might these historical findings inform current Buddhist traditions, which still draw heavily on commentators like Chandrakirti in their understanding of Buddhist texts and philosophies? Could Lopez's critical findings clear the way for a fresh, enriched, new appropriation of Buddhist understandings and interpretations? Could it offer something positive to Buddhist traditions today, strengthening their ability to meet the historical consciousness of the modern world by updating their understanding of the historical nature of their texts and institutions? Lopez's essay provided an insightful hermeneutic of suspicion. What it lacked was a hermeneutic of retrieval, fresh normative reflection in light of his critical findings. Now, I'll suggest one possible direction for such a hermeneutic of retrieval, just as an example of Buddhist constructive reflection. As Lopez noted, Buddhist scholars like Chandrakirti use the doctrine of skillful means to project their own perspectives back onto the Buddha. But why did they do so? One reason is that that doctrine served within the non-historicizing norms of Asian Buddhist cultures to grant the legitimacy essential for fresh historical developments to take expression in new cultural syntheses by attributing them to the Buddha himself. So Chandrakirti drew on the hermeneutic norms available to him in his time, including the doctrine of the Buddhist skillful means, to help legitimize the very fresh constructive analysis or constructive synthesis of his thought, which related themes, it's unendingly profound writing by Chandrakirti, which has been the basis of deep Buddhist practice in India and Tibet in particular for many centuries. What Chandrakirti did was relate themes from Indian scriptures that postdate Shakyamuni, as well as those that follow in his, close to his time, relating all that with Madhyamaka and Yogacara views of soteriology, ethics, contemplative theory, and Buddhahood, or enlightenment. So by equating his 7th century way of ordering such teachings with the skillful means of the Buddha from 1,200 years earlier, Chandrakirti found a way to valorize his system of thought, to give it the chance, really any chance, that it could be taken seriously within the scholarly communities of Indian Buddhism in his time, seriously enough to be worthy of serious attention, critical reflection, and debate, which it then stimulated to an enormous degree from 7th century India and to the present day. He valorized what he was doing because his sense of it was that it was potentially extremely valuable. So he used the means to valorize it that were available to him in his place and time. Like Chandrakirti in 7th century India, traditional Buddhist scholars in East Asian and Tibetan cultures have repeatedly drawn on the doctrine of skillful means to support fresh syntheses of Buddhist concepts with indigenous cultural religious perspectives and concerns, helping to legitimize diverse Buddhist traditions by anchoring each culturally conditioned system in scriptures associated with an unconditioned origin, the enlightened mind of Shakyamuni. So for example, Tsung Mi's 8th century construction of Huayan Buddhism in China integrated Confucian moral principles and Taoist cosmogonies with a system of Buddhist teachings derived from Mahayana scriptures ascribed to Shakyamuni. The origins of Chinese Chan, or Zen Buddhism, were ascribed to lineages of transmission directly from Shakyamuni through Bodhidharma, partly hiding the historical nature of Chan as an 8th century Chinese synthesis of Mahayana, a brilliant synthesis, an unbelievably brilliant synthesis of Mahayana Buddhist teachings with ontological and ethical concepts from Taoism and Mencian Confucianism. In Tibet, Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhist systems integrated indigenous Tibetan concerns and perspectives with teachings from Indian and Tibetan composed sutras and tantras that were also partly legitimated by their ascription to Shakyamuni and tantric deities associated with him. The doctrine of skillful means empowered people, liberated them to give expression, what was felt as an essential expression, to a fresh way of appropriating the Dharma within a culture, within each culture. So it could be tremendously effective. You see the parallels to the Christian theologians I quoted earlier, Karl Rahner, Yvonne Guevara, Gustave Gutierrez, Elizabeth Johnson, drawing on the frames of reference of their place and time and finding ways to legitimate their sense of obligation, moral obligation, to provide something fresh in this cultural context that could be appropriated and make a big difference. You follow what I'm saying? None of this would have been brought up by Professor Lopez, who did great critical work, but as a religious studies scholar, could not even raise any of these questions. How then should Buddhists today, in other words, that's critical constructive reflection, that's theological reflection, what I was just trying to do. So how then should Buddhists today read Mahayana scriptures and associate Asian Buddhist systems of thought and practice in light of this historical knowledge? Instead of viewing them anachronistically as teachings by Shakyamuni during different phases of his lifetime, we can understand them to represent a variety of Buddhist perspectives in conversation with each other and indigenous worldviews within diverse cultures over history. So Mahayana scriptures and systems of thought in Asia thus comprise a record of cultural adaptations of the Dharma that Buddhists today can draw on to inform the current adaptations of the Dharma needed to meet current cultures. The Dharma is the Buddha's teaching. New critical Buddhist reflection, importantly, is also now needed to consider what traditional Buddhist criteria should be drawn upon today to establish the legitimacy of developments in Buddhist thought and practice over history. It's not just a matter of being creative because you're a creative person. Does this way of understanding the Buddhist teaching, is this way of understanding it and the practices that that understanding supports, is it effective in eradicating the mental roots of suffering? Is it effective in supporting the deep realization of the Four Noble Truths, the generation of transcendental wisdom and universal compassion? Is it effective here, in this place and time, in this culture, in this dominant worldview? Is it effective? These are questions of legitimacy, not just, oh, being creative, that's a wonderful value. That is not a value per se. But creativity is an expression of transcendental wisdom and universal compassion. That's a high value, and that's also called skillful means. In sum, the hermeneutic of retrieval I'm suggesting uses Lopez's critical deconstruction of Chandrakirti's closed system of thought, which he had anachronistically ascribed to Shakyamuni, as a basis for now engaging diverse, culturally contextual sources of dharmic revelation, which can be drawn upon to inform multiple unclosed systems of Buddhist thought and practice in present and future contexts. Because this suggestion follows from historicizing what has not been previously historicized in traditional Asian Buddhist cultures, it is a relatively new normative proposal for traditional Buddhist institutions. If it were to be taken seriously, it would generate a strong new Buddhist interest in lots of new intra-Buddhist learning, since each Buddhist tradition models for each other tradition brilliant ways of adapting Buddhist teachings to new cultural contexts that make Buddhist paths of liberation freshly practicable. Each Buddhist tradition could be newly seen in that light as a precious resource for fresh doctrinal and practice reflection for each other Buddhist tradition. Since Buddhist traditions are also products of repeated integration of non-Buddhist religious, cultural, and cosmological elements into new Buddhist frameworks, as I mentioned with Huayan and Chan and Tibetan Buddhism, this historicized view of Buddhism should also motivate strong Buddhist interest in inter-religious and interdisciplinary dialogue to become familiar with non-Buddhist patterns of thought and practice in current cultures that, as in the past, must inform whatever new forms Buddhism will take today. I am making these normative suggestions for Buddhist traditions from an academic, critical, constructive Buddhist perspective. So I hope that was a clear enough example of what BCR or Buddhist theology means, and its contrast with religious studies method, which was represented by Professor Lopez. So what's been said so far provides one extended example of the first goal of BCR, that is, to draw on academic disciplines, in this case historical analysis, together with emic or insider Buddhist understandings, to try to inform Buddhism in fresh, normative, and helpful ways. Another prominent example of this first goal of BCR is Buddhist feminist analysis, which employs historical and social analysis to clear the way for a hermeneutic of retrieval that raises up key Buddhist principles. It's always, the critical analysis is to clear the way, to raise up key Buddhist principles in a new key. Buddhist principles upon which to build more non-patriarchal Buddhist institutions and systems of practice, for example, by supporting women teachers, restoring full monastic ordination for women who seek it, and promoting economic alternatives for young women in society. So leaders in such feminist critical constructive work have included Dhammananda Bhikkhuni, or Dr. Chotsur Min Kabul Singh, Wipurn Kwangao in Thailand, Rita Gross, Carmelekshe Somo, Anne Klein, Xiaolan Hu, and others. Another important example of this first goal of BCR is illustrated by the work of figures like Sulak Sivaraksa, Thich Nhat Hanh, A.T. Ariyaratne, Bhikkhu Bodhi, and also David Loy. Now, these Buddhist teachers have used modern social and economic analysis to reframe the Buddhist Four Noble Truths, moral precepts, divine abodes, and concepts of liberation as both spiritual and socio-political principles for diagnosing and addressing sufferings connected with dehumanizing modern socioeconomic forces. There are ways of combining etic social analysis with emic, Buddhist principles, to integrate personal and social liberative practice has reframed Buddhism for their followers in normative ways, while also bringing them into dialogue with current social theorists and also with Christian theologians. While the first goal, okay, that was the first goal of Buddhist constructive reflection. That first goal draws on current areas of knowledge together with insider understandings of Buddhism to suggest normative possibilities for Buddhism. The second goal of BCR is to draw on aspects of Buddhism to inform current areas of knowledge and to address current needs. Is that clear enough? And I'm going to talk about the second goal now, briefly. The second kind of goal has also played an important part in the history of Buddhism in Asia. Buddhist teachers and communities have drawn on a wide variety of Buddhist disciplines: ritual, meditative, philosophical, ethical, psychological, literary, artistic, and healing kinds of knowledge and disciplines to meet many culturally situated needs and concerns in Asia. And these have included the need for physical and mental healing, for help in dying and rebirth, for promoting harmonious relationships with ancestors, indigenous deities, and rival clans, for averting natural disasters, for creating new ethical and cosmological frameworks for societies, and for generating new kinds of learning in literature, philosophy, medicine, the arts, and more. So the history of Asian Buddhism is thus, in part, the history of the second goal of Buddhist constructive reflection, that is, to draw on Buddhist resources to meet numerous cultural needs and to introduce many new forms of knowledge into the culture. That seems to be what's also, again, happening now in the West. In East Asian and Tibetan cultures, to address so many mundane needs and concerns was not seen as contradicting the super-mundane Buddhist concern to realize nirvana and enlightenment. Since mundane and super-mundane applications of Buddhist power were both viewed as essential aspects of Buddhist participation in society. Mundane applications, like the ones I listed, enact Buddhist compassion in concrete ways and garner the social support necessary for Buddhist institutions to preserve the full range of Buddhist learning, both for attaining enlightenment and for addressing mundane needs. This repeated historical synthesis of Buddhism with indigenous cultures that I've been summarizing continues today. In modern Asian and Western forms of Buddhism, modern forms, this synthesis prominently includes elements of Western modernity. In Asian cultures, Buddhist concepts are integrated with modern social, economic, and political theories as resources for Buddhist thinkers to suggest alternatives to neoliberal capitalism and autocratic communist systems. In response to national traumas, poverty, and violence in Southeast Asia, Tibet, and China, a number of Asian Buddhist leaders, such as Thich Nhat Hanh, Sulak Sivaraksa, Buddhadasa, the Dalai Lama, A.T. Ariyaratne, Dhammananda Bhikkhuni, and others, have promoted modern kinds of social reform, human rights, and progressive cultural, political, and environmental practices, all informed by Buddhist principles. Westerners who have taken a strong interest in Buddhism, or converted to it, like myself, grew up within a modern worldview that is largely based in Western philosophical and religious assumptions, including scientific rationalism, romantic and transcendentalist notions of spirituality, the prominence of psychotherapy, individualism, egalitarianism, democracy, and modern Christian concepts of so-called social justice. and service. Conditioned by that worldview, many Western Buddhists have brought into their interpretations of Buddhism, not all, but many, they brought into their interpretations of Buddhism their own prior commitments to progressive social, political, and ecological ideals, personal spirituality, and therapeutic self-improvement. This is the synthesis of Buddhism with current cultures, these aspects of modernity. This synthesis of Buddhism with modernity, East and West, has conditioned the forms that the second goal of BCR has taken in academia and in Buddhist movements that apply Buddhism to contemporary needs and concerns. Buddhist thought and practice is drawn on to inform areas of philosophy, psychology, social theory, economics, cognitive science, ecology, and much more. Buddhist meditation methods adapted into secularized forms are applied to help treat physical and mental illnesses, addiction and trauma, and to inform new directions of research in clinical psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and medicine. Buddhist contemplative practices are also adapted to help healthcare professionals, therapists, social workers, educators, and activists avoid compassion fatigue and become more resilient and responsive to those they serve. So-called socially engaged Buddhist movements in Asia and the West have integrated Buddhist principles with social, economic, and political analyses to critique global consumerism, to offer new perspectives on human rights, environmental ethics, economics, criminal justice, and to address social problems like poverty and homelessness, both by meeting needs directly and by working for systemic changes. And these applications of Buddhism to modern problems bridge Buddhist and secular worlds of discourse, and also bridge academic and non-academic worlds of analysis, service, and activism. Thus, as David McMahon has noted, a prominent scholar in Buddhist studies, Buddhism is often now formulated by Buddhists and others in the languages of Western modernity, the languages of Western psychology, social science, ethics, and so forth. With David McMahon, I want to raise up two implications of this reformulation of Buddhism into languages of modernity. Also, I want to remind you, according to the earlier part of my talk, it is not in any way new for Buddhism to start speaking in the languages of the culture and time and place in which it's become integrated or becoming integrated. It will take up those languages, begin to speak through them. But there will be possibilities that are opened by that and some problems that might also come with that. And that's what I want to raise now. So I'm going to raise up two implications of this reformulation of Buddhism into languages of modernity. First, as in past cultural adaptations of Buddhism, Buddhism's current adaptations to modern cultures enable it to offer people new perspectives, insights, and critiques in their own languages and within their own worldviews, so they can seriously entertain them. Secondly, as Buddhism makes new contributions in those ways, it also risks accommodating itself so much to modern assumptions and values that it may lose part of its ability to critique them or to offer important alternatives to them. Is that sort of clear? You're all being very patient. Very good. So in the short time left, let's look at those 2 points and take modern, what's been called modern socially engaged Buddhism as an example. How is socially engaged Buddhism making significant new contributions, just very briefly, and how does it also risk accommodating itself too much to modernity? One valuable contribution, and again, this is an example of Buddhist critical constructive reflection, Buddhist theology. I'm not just describing developments, trying to make some normative suggestions for how things should be. So one valuable contribution of socially engaged Buddhism, I think, is the distinctive link it makes between individual and social conditioning in diagnosing and addressing social problems. Classical Buddhism identifies klesha, that is, delusive tendencies of misperception, greed, and ill will, avidya, raga, dvesha, as primary causes of individual suffering because they drive our minds, these delusive tendencies drive our minds to seek stable well-being by clinging to insubstantial phenomena, which generates dysfunctional reactions to our world, which further strengthens those delusive tendencies in our minds. And drawing from the social sciences, socially engaged Buddhist leaders link that classical focus on inner individual causes of suffering with outer social causes of suffering by arguing that these internal delusive tendencies take shape externally in destructive forms of social, economic, and political organization, which further strengthen then the internal delusive tendencies in the minds of all individuals involved. Because individual and social conditioning thus feed into each other, they argue, we cannot effectively address either individual suffering or the social, political, and ecological crises of our time without addressing both types of conditioning, individual and social. If, as in most modern social activism, I'll repeat that, in most modern social activism that I've been aware of, if we work only to change social and economic systems, the individual conditioning of delusion, greed, and ill will in everyone involved keeps reasserting itself in ways that distort and corrupt any new social system. We've seen this repeatedly in the history of the modern world, haven't we? Do I need to raise examples? A high ideal is taken up, an entire region of the world is taken over under the rubric of this ideal, and what follows is cultural or physical genocide of masses of people. So no attempt to address or even raise up the problem of the individual conditioning of everyone involved, including all the leaders of all such movements, not just the brilliant analyses of social conditioning. So I'll just repeat the last point. If we work only to change social and economic systems, the individual conditioning, greed, delusion, and ill will in everyone involved keeps reasserting itself in ways that distort and corrupt any new social system. The Soviet Union, Communist China, Communist Cambodia, and on and on. High ideals in their initial stage. But if we focus, as in classical Buddhism, just on practices to transform individuals, the conditioning influence of the social structures continues to instill and strengthen the delusive tendencies in individuals. So to undercut these delusive tendencies, socially engaged Buddhism offers culturally adaptive practices from diverse Buddhist traditions that must be applied both individually and socially. In individual practice, cultivation of insight into interdependence and emptiness, together with unconditional compassion, becomes a force for individual awakening that applies its power socially to confront problems of inequality, poverty, militarism, and ecological destruction. And in their social analysis and practice, engaged Buddhists draw both on Buddhist principles and on the social sciences to critique neoliberal economic systems that promote an endless expansion of greed for products, and to suggest ways to reorganize economies around a broader range of actual needs, material, ethical, cultural, ecological, and spiritual. Socially engaged Buddhism then thus offers not only a theoretical analysis of the interdependence of personal and social dimensions of suffering and liberation, but also concrete instruction for how to engage that interdependence in practice as a transformative power for both dimensions together, personal and social. I do think that makes an important contribution to the modern world, at least in theory and the attempt to practice that. But as noted, as Buddhist movements like socially engaged Buddhism offer such contributions to modern societies, they also risk accommodating themselves so much to modern assumptions that they can lose their ability to challenge those assumptions or to offer significant alternatives to them. In what follows, I'm going to speak to this point as an engaged Buddhist constructive thinker who practices in the Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhist traditions. While the most prominent Asian Buddhist leaders of socially engaged Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, Venerable Changyen, Buddhadasa, Venerable Dhammananda Bhikkhuni, and others, are renowned for embodying a really profound depth of awareness from long training in established Buddhist cultures and institutions in Asia. This is not the case for many Western socially engaged Buddhists who grow up in a cultural world of modern assumptions that contradict key Buddhist teachings. What modern assumptions, you may ask? So these include the common modern assumption that temporal well-being in the context of one lifetime is the ultimate human value. This is probably the dominant belief in modernistic societies today. Not nirvana or enlightenment. Temporal well-being in the context of one lifetime, that's the ultimate human value, not nirvana or enlightenment. The common assumption that physical and social conditions are the only real cause of suffering, not the delusive mental tendencies that Buddhism identifies, many of which are not fully conscious to us. and the common modernistic assumption that obvious forms of suffering are the only kind that exist or the only kind that are worth paying any attention to and addressing, ignoring subliminal levels of suffering taught in Buddhism that drive all of our harmful individual and social behaviors, which instill suffering in obvious forms on many beings. These key modern assumptions are part of the pre-understanding of many Westerners. We grew up with them. We were conditioned into them and by them. They're part of our pre-understanding, even before we think about them. Many Westerners involved in progressive movements, including socially engaged Buddhism. And those assumptions support the tendency in modern emancipatory movements to give all one's attention to establishing conditions for people's temporal well-being. But for engaged Buddhists, that exclusive focus on working to change the world's conditions can eclipse levels of Buddhist practice that focus on the empty, unconditioned nature of the world, where the unconditioned well-being and freedom of enlightenment is said to be found, which is associated with literally all-inclusive compassion and liberating activity that is directed literally to all beings caught in the sufferings of conditioned life and death, including many subliminal sufferings they're not even conscious of. Compassion that embraces literally all beings equally. Even when Western engaged Buddhists like myself echoed our Asian teachers in asserting the simultaneous practice of personal and social liberation, we are not necessarily operating at that level of practice. We can wind up implicitly reversing the primary and secondary goals of Buddhism, taking the social concern for people's conditioned well-being as primary, while downplaying the primary Buddhist goal of realizing unconditioned well-being, enlightenment, as a foundational support for all else. I'll just repeat that. We can wind up implicitly reversing the primary and secondary goals of Buddhism, taking the social concern for people's conditioned well-being as primary, while downplaying the primary Buddhist goal of realizing unconditioned well-being, enlightenment, as the foundational support for all else. Now, one sign of that reversal of priorities is the pervasive habit among modern activists, which I'm very familiar with in my own personal experience, the habit among modern activists of cultivating an affective preference for the so-called oppressed over the oppressors. I'm not just talking about a theoretically worked out preference for the oppressed or the poor. I'm talking about an affective preference for the so-called oppressed over the oppressors. To value one group as worthy while devaluing and implicitly despising the other group, which is rife in emancipatory movements, please don't deny it, which contradicts the literally unconditional and all-inclusive kind of compassion cultivated in Buddhist traditions. The latter is a compassion that recognizes an equal depth of dignity and worth in all beings within their Buddha nature. And it is a compassion that focuses not just on obvious sufferings, but also on less conscious levels of suffering and conditioning in everyone, which drive our harmful personal and social behaviors in which we are all caught here together, living and dying here together. I am not arguing for reducing the focus of modern Buddhist activity just to ultimate supramundane Buddhist goals. As I noted earlier, the history of Buddhism has always included a secondary focus on responding to temporal needs. I am arguing against losing the primary Buddhist goal of unconditioned well-being in our attachment to secondary goals of conditioned well-being, social and personal. And here I want to tip my hat to Bhikkhu Bodhi and Professor Shoden Gaiman, whose writing has informed this part of my own thinking. I'm arguing against losing the primary Buddhist goal of unconditioned well-being in our attachment to secondary goals of conditioned well-being, social and personal. I've observed in myself and other Buddhists involved in service and activism a tendency conditioned by our modern upbringings to absolutize the relative truth of the conditioned world in a way that loses awareness of the ultimate truth of it, the empty, unconditioned nature of that world. In Buddhist understanding, it is the awareness of ultimate truth, emptiness, that liberates the mind from habitual identification with its reified perceptions, thoughts, and reactions, and thereby frees the mind for greater discernment, equanimity, perseverance, creative responsiveness, and unbiased compassion for action. These powers of awakening are what help the mind avoid replicating its delusive tendencies, the inner causes of suffering, while still working to address social suffering. That is why cultivating the insight of emptiness with such awakening power is central to the Bodhisattva path. So I'm coming to conclusion now, so this part's worth listening to. If the primary Buddhist goal of inmost liberation does not remain primary in socially engaged Buddhism, taking that movement as an example of modernist Buddhism, delusive inner causes of suffering will be subliminally reinforced in the heat of service and activism, and the secondary Buddhist goal of promoting temporal well-being will not be actualized as effectively. We'll fall away from both goals in the name of taking up the secondary goal of conditioned well-being and mistaking it for the primary goal. We'll fall away from both goals. Is that kind of clear enough? Thus, Buddhism's fuller contribution to the modern world will be severely limited. To help avoid that, what do I suggest? I suggest the need for renewed emphasis in socially engaged Buddhism and all other forms of modern Buddhism on participation in and support for Buddhist institutions of intensive study and practice, prominently including monastic institutions, monks and nuns, in the full depth of study and training, as well as opportunities for lay Buddhists to practice into great depth, supported by that community. As I see this as foundational for modern Buddhists to learn how to progress into deepening levels of practice that touch in on the empty, unconditioned nature of all things, while serving and working for change in the conditioned world. To summarize then, the term Buddhist critical constructive reflection, I've abbreviated BCR and has also been called Buddhist theology, first emerged at the end of the 20th century in reaction to the way knowledge was organized at that time in the academic study of religion. But analogues of the two goals of modern BCR can be seen throughout the history of Buddhism in Asia and now the West. In each time and place, Buddhists have drawn on perspectives from the new culture to reframe Buddhism in ways that help it make fresh contributions to that culture and to thrive within it and learn from it. The two goals of modern BCR mirror those two aspects of Buddhist enculturation over history, Buddhism informing and affecting the new culture, as it is also being informed and affected by it. And this constitutes an historical cultural way of understanding the doctrine of skillful means, the ability of the Dharma to integrate with cultures in ways that effectively meet diverse mentalities and make new things possible. But as Buddhism makes new contributions in these ways to any culture, past or present, it also risks succumbing so much to the dominant assumptions of that culture that it can lose some of its ability to offer important alternatives to them. Hence, there is always a Buddhist need for critical constructive reflection to keep newly learning from and contributing to current cultures, while also always cultivating a healthy, critical awareness of the dominant assumptions of the cultures in which we are now integrating. Thank you all for your kind attention.